Good morning to you. I've got another chat for you this morning. Another check-in with a fellow comms pro to see what they're doing and sing on the front line of comms today. If you're new to this is the Public Relations Podcast. I'm Richard Midson. I'm a former news editor and PR myself, and today I study the comms world and somehow seem to be getting more and more involved in advocating the need for it too, as society and marketing changes rapidly right now with the advent of AI and also with the way that society seems to be becoming more and more fragmented with lots of different views and lots of different groups. But that's for another episode. Today, I've got a really interesting chat because, as usual, we don't shy away from any topic on here. Whether you agree with the subject matter or not doesn't matter on this program because what we're interested in is PR and comms technique. Now, Mike Mejer specializes in cannabis in North Carolina in the United States, but actually operates right across the country. And I've spoken to a few people in this space recently about the cannabis space and how complex it is at times. So this is going to be really interesting. Mike, first of all, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Richard. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this. I'm excited for it.
It is awesome to have you. Look, just tell us a little bit about some of the campaigns you're working on right now, what you're seeing as you're doing it.
Yeah, so I think a lot of the chatter and the buzz right now revolving around cannabis is really surrounding legalization, rescheduling, conversations around descheduling in some areas of the country. Especially with the election year, right? It's a big year. A
Right.
lot is up in the air. People are trying to figure out who's going to have a better program for the industry, for the community, what benefits are coming with different proposals and things like that. So I think that's really one of the biggest things that people are talking about right now. And that is what's really taking up, I think, a lot of the headlines in the news cycle right now at the moment for this industry.
And how are you adapting to that? Because, I'm not in the United States, so I don't hear about the issues that are currently kind of being discussed beyond the main headlines we get around the world. But how much is cannabis actually a part of that conversation and how much are you trying to make that part of the conversation? And how are you approaching it as well?
Interesting. Yeah, so it's definitely a big piece of the conversation, and I think over the last several years, it's become a larger part of mainstream media's conversations. We're even starting to see mainstream business outlets tap on the shoulders of cannabis industry leaders and executives when they're developing articles or putting together listicles or gift guides, whatever it may be. But just as the example I was sharing before, even mainstream business outlets, they're tapping on the shoulders of some of these executives, whether it's a privately held company or publicly traded company, and they're trying to get their insights as far as how this industry is impacting jobs, the economy, all these different facets that are sort of normalizing the conversations around cannabis. Whereas just a handful of years ago, or even a decade ago, it was known as the devil's lettuce and nobody wanted to talk about it. God forbid a journalist or reporter picked up a story on it that was positive or had even the slightest bit of a positive spin to it. It was a big no-no. And so now things have changed and shifted in a completely different direction. And it's pretty refreshing to see where it's going. And it's interesting to see how it's starting to become more normalized than ever before in the direction that it's going in. So I think a lot of people are on the edge of their seats, just trying to figure out where this whole industry is going from
Yeah.
a lot of different facets, from a business perspective, from an economy perspective, social justice,
It's so
and even
complex,
like
isn't it?
a
It really
political
is a
perspective too. Yeah.
complex topic with so many different. So you've got people who are kind of coming to you as thought leaders. So there's an opportunity straight away to be commenting on this and to develop those relationships. How much are
hmm
you able to actually kind of push a message though? Because you're obviously talking about the cannabis industry. So how much are you able to actually get? Um, are you putting out a lot of information which is supporting it, or are you talking about regulation? What I'm struggling with here is, well, what is the main core message you're putting across? Because it feels so complex in this particular space.
Yeah, it's complex because there's a lot of different angles that
Yeah.
come into play when you're talking about cannabis PR. So specifically, what my main focus is helping founders, faces, CEOs of companies get their brand and their business's narrative out into the marketplace and amplify that brand awareness, build trust, establish credibility, because there is a lot of noise, there's a lot of competition out there, and there's also a lot of restrictive regulations and things prohibiting cannabis companies from advertising and marketing and getting their names out there
Mm.
that a lot of traditional industries don't really think twice about. And so with those challenges in place,
Right.
when you're able to connect with a journalist or a reporter and answer a series of questions that they may have about, okay, how is this industry, how is your business that's opening up in this neighborhood going to impact the economy? Or if you are an HR expert and you happen to specialize in cannabis, now we're talking about HR in cannabis, and this is a conversation we've never had before. Or you're talking about a former NASA engineer that has built robots on Mars, and now they used to take the Martian atmosphere, turn it into oxygen, but then they left NASA. Now they're building robots for the cannabis industry. You've got so many different people coming in with different backgrounds and different areas of expertise. And so when you're able to extract those specific zones of genius and pair them up with the reporters and the journalists and the editors that are looking to gain insights into specific facets of the industry, that's how you're able to bring all these different perspectives that may sound complex, but you get these experts that really understand their niche perfectly, and they're able to come in and comment and bring the right information to the right people at the right time to help this complex puzzle make sense and bring a little bit of clarity to people who are kind of curious and want to understand how all of this works.
So are you finding that journalists are mainly coming to you, or you're having to pitch more?
So with the staff cuts in media, we still
Yeah.
have to pitch.
Yeah.
With that said, just through media relations, and I'm sure you've experienced this too as a PR pro. After so many collaborations with different journalists or reporters, at a certain point, they may just reach out to you and say, "Hey, look, I'm putting together a
I'm doing
piece.
this.
I've got
Absolutely.
questions about XYZ. Do you think you'd be able to connect me with this person or that person that I've worked with before? They were great to work with. Can you make an intro again?" So
Mm.
that happens as well. But again, just with the staff cuts with different publications, it's still a push effort for most of it.
That's really interesting because we were talking just shortly before we started recording about the way that the space has changed as well. And you actually mentioned,
Mhm.
because we were talking about podcasting, you mentioned the
Mhm.
fact that when podcasting kind of kicked off, there was a lot of cannabis podcasts. Just tell everyone about that and how that has changed how you've approached things.
Yeah, so I was actually thinking about this quite a bit recently over the last month or so. And 3, 4, 5 years ago, and I'm sure any other PR pro in this space would agree, there were so many podcasts you could not even keep count. And there was a new podcast coming. It almost seemed like there was a new podcast coming out every single day. Everybody and their grandmother had a podcast that was focused on cannabis. And I don't know if this is correct. I don't know if my hypothesis is going to play out like this, but I suspect that a lot of people thought that because it was an emerging market, still is an emerging market, that they were going to be able to come in, get that exponential curve to success, get in quickly at the right time, land a bunch of big advertisers, make a bunch of money, become, the next number one podcast on Spotify easier
Yeah.
than, let's say, in another industry.
Mm.
And it just so didn't happen to play out that way for a lot of people. And so I think that's why when you had this massive pool of podcasts in the industry, in the community, now if you fast forward to today, that number has shrunk significantly. And so it's very interesting to see how certain podcasts and folks have been shaken out over time.
So have you found then that you've got just a few kind of big ones in that space now? And then obviously you've got the competition of trying to get your story on there compared to others. I mean, I suppose in the past, you had a lot of small podcasts, but it was quite easy to get someone anywhere.
Yeah, it's that's a great point. So I think it may have been easier just because of the sheer number of podcasts that were out there,
Mm.
but you still had to make sure that it was a right fit, because even looking back when there was a tremendous amount of podcasts out there several years ago, if they were very tailored and very focused on a certain aspect of the industry and the community. So I'll give you a quick example. There were cannabis podcasts that were focused strictly on business. There were cannabis podcasts that were strictly focused on the publicly traded markets. There were certain podcasts that were focused strictly on consumer behavior and lifestyle patterns and things like that, that were more consumer focused. And so, with that said, you couldn't just kind of use the spray and pray approach. You still had to have a very
Mm.
tailored, targeted media outreach approach, because otherwise, they're just going to get sick of you and they're going to put you on that block or do not email me list. So even that was happening back then.
What about with influencers? Because in this particular space, and when you're talking about regulations and policy and all this kind of thing, I imagine with influencers, it's quite a risky area because you just don't know what they're going to say or do on their feed, do you?
Yeah, correct. And so that's why when working with influencers, you really have to do your due diligence and your homework and make sure that either they know how to play within the rules and not go out of bounds and cause problems and issues. And then as a quote unquote insurance policy, you as the person or as the PR pro or the brand need to make sure that you make those expectations and those rules that they need to play within very, very clear, because the last thing you want to do is, dedicate a big chunk of your budget to an influencer that hits your target audience perfectly, and they would create great content, and then all of a sudden 24 hours after the post or the series of posts goes live, everything gets taken down. So that's the tricky thing with influencers. It's over communicating just to make sure that you cover all your bases and work around some of those strict regulations.
And there's obviously, influencers in every market, but do you find that the influencers in the cannabis market are perhaps better educated about what the rules and regulations are, because they've obviously got to keep themselves online, haven't they?
Yeah, so that's an interesting conversation as well, because when people say cannabis influencers, brands are also a little bit more conscious of the fact that you don't necessarily need to go to an influencer that just puts out cannabis related content, because a lot of cannabis consumers, they may not even necessarily follow a lot of cannabis
Yeah.
focused content. They may
Yes.
be athletes, or they may be business people, or they may be parents that maybe don't work. Maybe it's a stay at home mom and she's just looking for a way to take the edge off after a long day, or an athlete looking for recovery, and so they're focusing or following a lot of fitness content. And so depending on the target audience, you really want to think twice about just doubling down on a influencer that
Mm.
only talks about cannabis versus somebody who really truly gets buy-in from your target audience.
Yeah, it's where the people are compared to what the actual specific topic is. What have you seen that's kind of coming up next in this space, and how do you think this kind of the PR will have to adapt to it?
I think the PR adapting, I think, is really going to rely heavily on the media landscape, not necessarily the industry. And so just understanding, reading the room, continuing to follow along and understand how the teams working at certain publishers or media outlets or podcast shows, where they're going, what they're covering, what they want to talk about, what they don't want to talk about, different products that they're fans of, things like that. And I think just staying on top of those
The
trends and being
trends.
aware and maintaining those relationships, that's really going to be key, and understanding what they want to learn more about and what gets them excited. I think that's going to be the big thing that you want to keep tabs on as this industry continues to evolve.
One of the other things I noticed is you're specializing in cannabis PR. And,
Mhm.
we talk about the way that the PR and comms industry is changing all the time, and how particularly independents have struggled to fight to compete against some of the bigger companies. And by doing that niche, it seems to be a very successful way of doing it, by focusing in on one particular thing, because then you become the go-to voice. What kind of impact has that had on you by niching?
In what regards specifically?
Well, and in other words, you're not just a general PR firm saying we'll do everything. You're
Mhm.
saying, look, we are a cannabis PR firm. We're specializing in this space. So, how much has that helped you in terms of getting clients and business and relationships as well with media and everyone?
Yeah, so that's helped out tremendously, and we've actually won a lot of deals that we've gone up against some of these bigger agencies, and we don't have a 40-person team. It's or some super swanky New York City Fifth Avenue office, and we've won those deals because of the fact that we are cannabis specific and cannabis focused. And when I tell somebody that, hey, look, we specifically work with within the cannabis industry, we've been doing this for about 6, coming up on 7 years soon, and this is what we do day in and day out. And so we have these relationships. And I always say it's always the story that sells. It's not the relationship, because I can't call somebody up and say, hey,
Yep.
publish this story. That's not how it works.
Yeah, if it's a rubbish
But
story, they're not going to use it. No.
exactly. But having those relationships and understanding how the landscape of cannabis media is shifting, or the current state of it, or what they're looking more of, or what they're looking to not cover at this time because of certain industry developments as it relates to, legalization, rescheduling, things like that. Just having a very good pulse on where the industry and community are at feels like a full-time job. And so people understand that and recognize that when they're making a decision to pick a potential PR partner to kickstart a program with. And I think that holds a lot of value for us and continues to be a big selling point, really.
We're out of time. How can people get hold of you if they want to?
Greenlanecommunication.com. So people could check out our website there and see all the cool things that we're doing. And I'm also super accessible on LinkedIn. People can search me there. I'm putting out content daily, just educating people about PR, the ins and outs. So would love to connect with folks on LinkedIn.
Awesome. We could talk for hours. As always, thank you so much, Mike.
Appreciate you, Richard. Thank you so much for having me.